Hello guys, this will be lesson number 3 in our course about Travel API. This will be an endpoint, public endpoint API with version 1 of that API to list paginated travels. As usual, I will repeat that on YouTube I have video versions of those lessons and text-based version are available for premium members on laraveldaily.com, and I will link that in the description below. On top of that, you have access to GitHub, Discord to talk to me and maybe review your code, and also additional links to read more information about things I talk about in this video. And I hope some of you already tried to create that endpoint from the task in the video I gave previously yesterday. So now I will list my version of that, and tomorrow, task for tomorrow for you is, if we take a look at the Google Docs with job description, it's this one: public endpoint to get paginated tours by Travel Slug. So first you do this without any filtering. Filtering will be a separate lesson. For now, just another public endpoint for tomorrow. And today we have the list of paginated travels, so this one. Next in this course we're working on this point: public endpoint to list the paginated travels with only public travels available. So in my PHP store, I just create the API controller first for travel controller. So PHP artisan make controller, and this is interesting: API/v1/travel controller. So as you can see, immediately I have two prefixes, not one but two namespace prefixes, each with their own goal. So API means that there will be API controllers there, so maybe in the future there will be web controllers or something else. And then V1, immediately I set up every API for version 1, even if there is no version 2 planned at the moment. You never know what happens in a year or two, so V1 will be everywhere in the subfolder as well, and you will see in a minute where else. So we have the controller. Now we need the route for that. So in the routes API we have this, and now we just need the list of travels. So we do route get travels and travel controller class here. And here we have a few choices as well. Since for now we have only one method in that controller, the list, we may make that as so-called invocable controller or single action controller, which will have only invoke method. And in the text form of this lesson, you will see the link to that documentation about invocable controllers. But in this case, I have a feeling that in the future there will be more methods, so it's more of a typical like resource controller. So there will be maybe travel show or travel edit or something like that. So we just have controller and index method. Also, I prefer that controller names would not be in full here. Instead, I put them out on top in use section here. So use controller, and then we don't need that, all that prefix here, like this. And then at this point, our URL endpoint for API would be /API/travels. But I also want to incorporate versioning in the URL endpoints. So it would be /API/v1/travels. So in the future, there would be API v2 travels and stuff like that. And there are a few ways where we can incorporate, where we can add that v1. First, of course, the most straightforward would be here, v1/travels. But of course, the obvious drawback of that we would need to do the same thing in all the routes that would be created in the future. So that is not flexible. Another option would be to have route group, so route prefix of v1 and then group, and then all the routes inside here. But personally, if I have only one version, I like the more flexible and kind of hidden approach of setting the v1 for all the routes inside that file, and that is done in route service provider of Laravel at the moment. So you have routes web and routes API by default loaded here, and the prefix default for routes API is API. So in here we just add v1, and then all the routes that are inside of routes API would be accepted with the prefix v1. Great, now let's go inside of that controller and let's actually create that method. So we go public function index and we return travel model where public. We remember that condition from the client, so is public true, and then we just return the get from Eloquent, and Laravel will automatically transform that to JSON if it is Eloquent collection. And now we can launch our first endpoint in Postman or in any API client, but I will use Postman. So I'm here in the Postman, and as you can see, /API/view1/travels with get method, we send and we have the result. At the moment I have one record in the database and it is returned as it is with all the fields from the database. Great, we have our first API endpoint working. But I see a few problems in the way that we return data just as it is from Eloquent database table. First, typically API clients don't need to know about created at and updated at timestamps. It's kind of like system fields. Then we don't need to return is public because we are filtering by public. And also we need to return number of nights. Remember, we have a virtual field which is by default not returned. So we need to transform that into our own set of fields exactly returned as we want. And for that, typically developers use Eloquent API resources. So we generate a specific class, PHP Artisan make resource travel resource, and then in the controller we change that from where is public get to return travel resource here collection, and this is the actual collection. To make it a bit more readable, we could extract that into its own variable. So there will be travels, for example, and we will populate those travels here on top like this. A bit more readable. And now in that travel resource, we specify all the rules, what fields to return in what format. So instead of the default parent to array, we specify that we need to return the ID exactly as it is. This refers to the actual travel model. We don't need is public. We do need name and slug as they are. So this name, also let's duplicate slug, then duplicate number of days like this, number of days, and also we return number of nights, and it will call Eloquent Accessor to actually calculate that. And what did I forget? The description. So we need description as well, like this. And now if we launch the same Postman endpoint, we have something like this. So two changes here. First change is for the structure exactly as we want it, including that number of nights. And also you may have noticed the data. Eloquent API resources by default add so-called wrapper, another layer of data here. It is configurable. You can disable that, and in the text form lesson you will find the link how to do that in the documentation of Laravel, but I do advise you to stay with it because, as you will see in a minute, it allows you to add more information on top of data. So not only data, but for example, information about pagination. And this is exactly our next step. We need to introduce pagination here. Luckily in Laravel it's very simple, so you need to change get to paginate, and that's it. So now if we launch our Postman API endpoint, we have the same data, but now you see how data is beneficial because it adds more information. It allows you to add any messages, any extra information for the API client. In this case, Laravel adds links to the next page or previous page if exists, and then some meta information about how many records per page, total, and stuff like that. You can customize that pagination in a lot of ways. For example, by default it is paginated by 15 records per page. You can set that to 10, to 5, or make that number configurable in the config. But now we've achieved what client wanted: paginated list of travels, filtering with only public records. But that's not all in this lesson. Let's start writing automated tests along the way. As I mentioned, I'm a big fan of writing tests as soon as some feature is finished while it is fresh in the memory. So this is exactly what we have here. The feature is finished for now, the travel list. Now we need to test that automatically with PHPUnit test. Of course, it's your personal preference. You can use PEST, but I will use a classic PHPUnit in Laravel. And before we use that PHPUnit, we need to kind of set up the whole test suite of Laravel for testing. And a few things here. First, Laravel ships with default tests, so tests feature example test and unit example test. And let's delete both of them because now if you launch PHP Artisan test just like that in the terminal, it would show example tests which are kind of meaningless. So I immediately delete both of them. The folders still stay because maybe in the future there will be unit tests. For now, we will create the feature test as client required. And now let's create our test with PHP Artisan make test. And the first test will be travels list test, I called it. It's your personal preference how to structure those tests in files and methods, but I prefer to have some kind of feature in one file and then different cases of that feature as methods inside of that file. So in this case, we'll have one file with two methods. I will show you that in a minute. So travels list test, which would basically test everything around that endpoint. And now we can close the terminal, open that travels list test, and write two methods. The main thing about writing automated tests in general is not about the syntax, how to write that, but about in your head to come up with scenarios what to test and what are different cases. So in our case, I think we can test two things. One thing, that the data is returned correctly with pagination and with status code 200 of API, and then whether it filters is public correctly. So two separate methods that would call the same API endpoint. So for the first method, let's call it test travels list returns paginated data correctly or something like that. And that name is important, by the way, because that will be the result in PHP Artisan test. So this should be readable and understandable for everyone. And what we need to do here, we need to call API v1 travels. We need to check that the status code is 200, but first we need to create some kind of travel record and then assert that it is existing in the result and that we have paginated data. To create that travel record in the fake database, we need to first set up the fake database and then create a factory to create that fake data. To work with fake data, first let's set up the database, the separate testing database, so we would be sure that the test doesn't wipe our database. And wiping the database happens with this thing, refresh database. If your feature test work with database, which in our case is true, then you need to use refresh database, which means that every time with every test, Laravel will run PHP Artisan migrate fresh and will give you fresh empty database with the structure, so with all the database tables, but without the data. And then inside of your test, you set up your scenario, you create fake records, and then do the testing. So we need to have refresh database, but we need to set up in PHPUnit XML in the default Laravel file. We have these two lines, which are important, and we need to uncomment them, so we need to enable them. Of course, it's only one way of setting up your test. Let me explain in a minute. So by default, Laravel suggests that you run test on SQLite database in memory. And this is very convenient if you have SQLite set up. The syntax is mostly the same with MySQL if you use MySQL, but alternatively, if you don't have SQLite set up, or if you prefer MySQL because you have MySQL specific syntax of some kind, then you may go to config database PHP file in Laravel, set up testing database, actually physically create that on your server, and then set up DB connection and DB database name here. But I will use SQLite memory. The most important thing is do specify the separate database, otherwise that refresh database trait will wipe out all the data you have locally. And now we can actually create that travel fake data, and we will create with factory. We don't have that factory yet, but we will create that in a minute. Let's create 16 records because by default pagination is 15 per page, and we will test that we return 16 records, but only 15 of them are returned with data with 2 pages. So we create that 16 records, then we get that API call, and then we assert that the status is 200, and then there are a few more assertions. Since API works with JSON and returns the JSON structure, we can assert a lot of things with JSON. In the text form of this lesson, there will be a link to JSON assertions from Laravel documentation, but what we need in this case, assert JSON count 15 data, which means that the data wrapper data level will contain 15 records and not 16. So this is one thing that we will test, and another thing will be assert that the JSON path, specific path of the result, is meta. There's one thing called last page. We need to test that it's actually 2. So we have 2 pages, last page is 2 and not 1. Now let's take care of the factory. Factory is a class that would define the set of rules for data for model, for fake model of travel. So this is how we generate that, make factory with model travel. And now if we open that up in database factories, travel factory, we need to populate, we need to fill in the array of what fields under what rules will be generated. So for name of travel, we have fake text of 20 symbols, and fake is a helper in Laravel 9. Before that there was this faker, and it has a lot of methods to generate any fake data. For example, is public has fake boolean true or false, and then for description we'll have a text of 100 characters, for example, so fake text 100, and also we need number of days, which will be randomly, even without faker, we can just do random from 1 to 10. So this is the default factory that would be generated not in the controller here, but in the test. But we need to override one field. We need to make sure that all 16 of them are public, which means is public true, and in here we can override any parameters as array, any fields is public or something else. And now it's time for us to launch our test. So PHP Artisan test, is it successful? Yes, it is. Now we've successfully tested that the endpoint actually works. And as a proof that it may not work, for example, if I remove that and generate random 16 records and then relaunch Artisan test, it will fail because actual size of 10 public records is not the same as 15. So the test works. And now we'll add another test. Let's copy and paste the method. Test for actually filtering the is public. Test travel list shows only public records. Something like this, records. So we create one travel with is public true. We create another travel with is public false. And then we launch the same travels. And then we assert that the data has one record and 0, which is the first element, name, equals, let's assign that to a variable, public travel, and we have public travel name here. And now clear, let's relaunch our test. Is it successful? Yes, we have another method within the same test that tests that list shows only public records. Okay, great. Now we have one feature and feature tests for that feature. In the next lesson, we will get to another public endpoint, which will be a list of tours by travel.